Out of all the legendary weapons in Elden Ring, one has always stood out to me as equally parts special and strange. A legendary golden sword that shines with the beauty and power of the Elden Ring itself, that is said to have been forged by none other than Lord Radagon of the Golden Order. This regal-looking weapon honestly seems like something we should find proudly displayed in the middle of Leyndell's throne room. And yet that couldn't be further from the truth. Why on earth is this epic weapon held by what seems to be a random enemy, hiding out in an obscure cave? My search for answers actually changed not only how I view this sword, but how I view Lord Radagon, Queen Marika, and Elden Ring's story itself. I welcome you, Tarnished, to join me, Zayf the Scholar, as I try to uncover the truth behind the Golden Order Greatsword and its connections to Lord Consort Radagon and his hidden sins. Let's talk about it. But before we get into all the details, thanks to Opera GX for sponsoring this video. In a world filled with interruptions and distractions, Opera GX is a browser that gives you the weapons you need to fight them off. I personally love the pop-out feature that lets me keep watching while I check out the lore discussions unfolding in the comments. And it's also fantastic that it has an ad blocker built in, as well as privacy protection via a free VPN that lets you access content from different regions without needing any extra software. But my personal favorite are the GX mods that let you change everything from UI sounds and background music to the font, icons, and even set dedicated wallpapers and splash screens. Fine-tune your browser to get the exact vibe you're looking for, from cyberpunk to dark fantasy. Want to try but switching seems like a pain? No worries. Opera GX is equipped with a tool that quickly imports all your browsing history, bookmarks, and cookies in just seconds. So, what are you waiting for? Use my link in the description or pinned comment below and try Opera GX for free today. So in order to understand why this seemingly random enemy is holding Radagon's legendary Golden Order Greatsword, we first have to understand what exactly this creature, the Leonin Crusader, is, and why it's actually pretty important. Which means it's finally time to delve into the lore behind the Misbegotten. What exactly are these chimeric creatures anyway? And why do they look this way? Well, despite being a pretty prominent enemy type throughout Elden Ring, we actually aren't told much about the Misbegotten explicitly. Aside from the description of the winged Misbegotten ashes, which states, "The Misbegotten are held to be a punishment for making contact with the Crucible, and from birth, they are treated as slaves, or worse." Now, one thing I want to touch on is that many people in the community seem to have interpreted this text to mean that the Misbegotten were once a normal race of creatures, perhaps even humans, that touched the Crucible and were punished for their hubris. Sort of like an Icarus flying too close to the sun situation, if you will. And while that technically could be the case, I think it's important to note that this description doesn't specify that the Misbegotten themselves were the ones that made contact with the Crucible. The agent behind this action is actually left unstated. We can only say with certainty that contact with the Crucible was made by someone, and the Misbegotten's punished existence resulted. It's a subtle difference, but this description is a lot more ambiguous than people seem willing to acknowledge. And looking at the Japanese text here further solidifies this deliberate ambiguity. So let's break it down line by line for some added context. 今週は The Misbegotten are said to exist as a punishment of touching the Crucible. Slaves from birth, they are impure. So again, like in the English localization, we have the action of the Crucible being touched, but the subject of this action is deliberately left unstated. And so I don't think we can necessarily jump to the conclusion that their blended, misshapen form is actually their own doing. And honestly, I don't think that it is. But more on that in a bit. Because before we get there, we can also get more insight into the Misbegotten by breaking down the etymology of their English and Japanese names. As we saw a moment ago, the Japanese name for Misbegotten is Konshu, which translates literally to something like mixed species or mixed breed. The character on the left, Kon, means to mix, blend, or combine, while the one on the right, Shu, means species or varieties. And considering that the Misbegotten are visibly a literal blend of different creatures, that makes sense. The English localization Misbegotten, meanwhile, is a lot more literary in its naming sensibility, and possibly a lot more telling from a lore perspective. According to the Merriam-Webster's dictionary, the word beget means to procreate or to have children, but from the perspective of a father rather than a mother. The prefix mis in misbegotten, meanwhile, imparts a negative aspect. Think words like mistake, misgiving, or mistrust. Taken together then, the misbegotten, therefore, we can take to be children that were born or sired by a father, but in an incorrect or mistaken way. Or perhaps children that came into existence by mistake. Considering that motherhood and matriarchy is such a huge part of Elden Ring's lore, particularly in terms of all the symbolism and themes surrounding Queen Marika, Queen Renalla, the grandmother, and even Mater, the mother of Fingers, it's very interesting that the Misbegotten are a rare case of emphasized paternity or fatherhood. And this gets more intriguing still, when you consider that in Elden Ring's data-mined game files, the Misbegotten are referred to as Radagon no Kora, which translates literally to children of Radagon. And we can also note that in the unpatched 1.0 version of the game, the Misbegotten are tellingly referred to as Radagon Chimera. And with this information in hand, the appearance of the Leonin Misbegotten becomes even more thought-provoking. Its red hair certainly seems to evoke Radagon, who is depicted with red hair in his portraits, as well as in various item descriptions. Most notably the giant's red braid, which states, "Every giant is of red hair, and Radagon was said to have despised his own red locks. Perhaps that was a curse of their kind." We also know that this is a trait Radagon passed on to some of his children, which we can clearly see in the description of Radagon's helmet, which states, Radagon inherited the furious, flaming red hair of his father Radagon, and is fond of its heroic implications. And I don't know what to make of it exactly, but is it purely a coincidence that Radagon came to be known as the Red Lion General, and these Radagon-linked creatures are called Leonin Misbegotten? I'm curious to know if you have any thoughts there, so drop me a comment if you do. But in any case, I think the main question becomes, could the Misbegotten actually trace their origin back to Radagon directly? Did he somehow make contact with the Crucible and beget these cursed progeny? Are they perhaps failed attempts at procreation before his union with Renalla? Or, as Reddit user Aggravating Weird 3 suggests, could they be aspects of Radagon that were split off or cast away by him deliberately? The ability to exhibit split selves is of course a trait that Marika and many of the demigods exemplify, and that can perhaps be attributed to Marika's shaman roots, and their unique ability to blend with other life forms. Or as we learn from the Tooth Whip, the flesh of shamans was said to meld harmoniously with others. We can also note that both of Radagon's children with Marika exhibit this quality by having aspects of themselves that were divested or split off. It's well known, for example, that Miquella cast aside and abandoned Saint Trina in the Land of Shadow, leaving her stranded at the bottom of the coastal fissure. His sister Malenia, meanwhile, propagated offshoots of herself after her bloom during the Battle of Aeonia, which is widely believed to be the origin point of Millicent and her kin. And although not a child of Radagon per se, We know that Godwyn the Golden is also split into numerous cursed offshoots that we can find in both the Land of Shadow and in the basement of Stormveil Castle in the base game. In the English text, these strange faces are cryptically referred to as cadaver surrogates, but in the Japanese these are called wakemi, which translates roughly to split off pieces or split bodies. And not so coincidentally, I think, this word, wakemi, only appears in one other place in Elden Ring. It's the same word Millicent uses to describe her relationship to Malenia, saying, quote, "I'm actually of Malenia's blood, but I don't know if I'm her child, her little sister, or perhaps a wakemi." And we of course shouldn't forget about the split relationship shared by Marika and Radagon himself, which many people speculate is a direct parallel to Miquella and Trina's relationship. So is it possible that the Misbegotten are Radagon wakemi, pieces of himself that diverged or were cast aside for unknown reasons? I mean, we do find the Leonin Misbegotten wielding the Golden Order greatsword in the Cave of the Forlorn, a word typically used to describe the sadness that comes from being abandoned. And this cave is also remotely located, being on the mountaintops of the Giants, and has a sealed entrance that must be unlocked with a stone sword key. So is it not possible that this Leonin Misbegotten was dumped here and sealed away by Radagon? It also seems worth pointing out that the Cave of the Forlorn may have been visited by Miquella at some point, as we can find nascent butterflies on some of the corpses within, and despite being a rare item elsewhere, Miquella's lilies are found here in abundance, and are actually what guide us to the hidden pathway leading down to the Leonin Misbegotten, who, like Trina, isn't just at ground level, but is instead found at the bottom of a subterranean fissure. So did Miquella perhaps take inspiration from the actions of his father when he abandoned Trina at the bottom of a fissure? And on the subject of Trina, my buddy Scum Mage Info was kind enough to point out to me that the path to Trina herself is guarded by none other than the spirit of a Leonin Misbegotten. I'm honestly not sure what to make of this yet, but it seems like it has to be connected somehow. So if you have any thoughts, let me know. But returning to our central question, could Radagon have taken this defiled piece of himself and locked it away here, along with a memento of a union that he would prefer to be forgotten? Does this perhaps somehow relate to the Red Wolf of Radagon that was left behind in the debate parlor of Raya Lucaria Academy before we encounter Queen Renalla? Or perhaps, did the birth of the Misbegotten somehow involve the Amber Egg that Radagon is said to have gifted to Renalla upon his departure? We know that this egg is incredibly powerful and is used by Renalla to birth the cursed sweetings we encounter during her fight. It's also critical for our own rebirthing rituals. And of course, Bok's botched one. Bok himself having tons of interesting parallels to Radagon that I think I'll have to save for a dedicated video in the future. Hey guys, Zayf in Post here. So after having a bit more time to think about the Amber Egg, I had a bit of an epiphany about what it is that I think makes a lot of sense. So I might have been a bit dense here, but up until now I'd always thought it was called an Amber Egg in a figurative sense due to its golden yellow hue. But when I was reading the Japanese text, I realized that they use the word kohaku, which, unlike the English word amber, isn't really used to describe a color. Instead, it refers almost exclusively to the stone-like material that results from tree resin fossilizing over a long period of time. So in short, this egg that once belonged to Radagon is perhaps not just amber-colored, but literal amber, or petrified tree sap. And being that we know that the crucible is described as the primordial form of the Erd tree, it seems plausible to me that the amber of this egg was formed from the sap of the crucible. and I think this serves as further evidence that it was in fact Radagon being referred to in the description of the winged misbegotten ashes. It was Radagon who came into contact with the crucible and brought about the misbegotten's punished existence. And again, given their name, we can surmise this probably wasn't something he did intentionally, but was rather an unwanted side effect of some other plan. Although what he intended to do with this ball of crucible sap, and why he gave it to Renalla, remains a mystery. Although I will also add that according to my Japanese colleague, to a native Japanese speaker, the word kohaku also invokes thoughts of precious stones or gems. So another likely nuance being expressed here is that this was a precious or treasured gift from Radagon to Renalla. And speaking of Renalla, let's now turn to the item description of the Golden Order Greatsword, because it's something really interesting that I think deserves more attention. Its description states, Greatsword made of light, modeled after the Elden Ring itself. Forged by King Consort Radagon to proudly symbolize the tenets of the Golden Order. One of the legendary armaments. Telltale signs betray that this was once the greatsword bequeathed to him by his first wife, Renalla. As we learn from our questline with Ranni, as well as the description of the Dark Moon Greatsword, it's a long-standing Carian tradition for the queen to bestow her spouse with a moon greatsword to commemorate their union. And looking at the shapes of these blades side by side, it would seem that Radagon took his gift from Renalla and forged it into something else entirely, hammering out and perhaps trying to hide away a powerful sign of the Carians under the facade of the Golden Order. And this, I think, nicely captures a dark and recurrent theme in Elden Ring's lore. History is written by the victors, and the Golden Order has a tendency to cover up and hide away anything that might hint at their past transgressions. This perfectly correlates to the Omen, beings covered in what were once coveted horns that were symbols of divinity under Hornsent rule, that instead came to be brutally shunned and hidden away underground. Or as we learn from the Omen Bairn and Regal Omen Bairn descriptions. Doll of a curse-born bairn. Omen babies have all their horns excised, causing most to perish. Omen babies born of royalty do not have their horns excised, but instead are kept underground, unbeknownst to anyone, imprisoned for eternity. These memorial fetishes are fashioned in secret. And the Omen are of course by no means the only ones to suffer this type of treatment. Even the Crucible Knights, who were once revered enough to serve as the elite guard of Godfrey, were not exempt, or as the Crucible Knight set states, holds the power of the Crucible of Life, the primordial form of the Erd Tree. In time, the strength shown by these knights, and even their appearance, was seen as chaotic and deserving of scorn. So I think this again aptly illustrates the Golden Order's tendency to redefine what is venerated and what's scorned, based purely on political convenience. The Crucible Knights were foundational to the establishing of the Erd Tree, yet even they weren't spared eventual betrayal and abandonment. And finally, the Shadow of the Erd Tree DLC provides perhaps the most egregious example of this pattern of behavior, as after Messmer's successful crusade against the Hornsent, he and the entire Land of Shadow were hidden away and abandoned. The entire Hornsent culture and their veneration of the Crucible lost to the annals of history. And so I think it makes sense that this Leonin Misbegotten, with its flowing red hair akin to the Giants, and its blended animal features that harken to the Crucible, is something Radagon would want locked away in a cave to be forgotten. It is, after all, Misbegotten, and as that name implies, was born improperly and unwanted. And that actually leads us nicely to talking about another Misbegotten, with some very telling ties to Radagon. In the base game, we're told by the description of the hammer that the art of smithing is said to have originated among the Giants. And this in itself would already be an interesting tie to Radagon, considering the description of the red braid we discussed earlier, giving him a connection to the Fire Giants. But in the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, things get even more interesting, as we learn that the act of blacksmithing was once considered to be tied to divinity. This is, for example, supported by the description of the smithing talisman, which states, "In ancient times, smithing was a divine act, and blacksmiths interpreted the script they perceived in the wrinkles of molten steel to imbue weapons with souls." And this divine ritual aspect is also supported by the description of the anvil hammer, one of the treasures of the ruined forges, a tremendous hammer that incorporates as its head the red-hot anvil of the forge. It is said that the anvil's shape is inspired by that of an altar, and that long ago, it was indeed used in such rite and ritual. So importantly, what we can take from all this is that more than just crafting or strengthening weaponry, smithing was once tied to worship, divinity, and godhood. And yet, throughout our journey, our smithing is primarily handled not by a demigod or even a Tarnished, but instead by smithing master Hugh, an imprisoned Misbegotten. And this is something I've honestly wondered about for a while. Why is Hugh such a skilled blacksmith? How would a cursed Misbegotten come to master a divine art? Well, we're only ever told about 3 individuals capable of smithing weaponry. Hugh, a Misbegotten. E.g., a troll, a race that's tied to the fire giants. And Lord Radagon himself. 2 races that were subjugated and persecuted by the Golden Order, and the Golden Order's poster boy, who has a complex about his own roots. There's a triple entendre for you. It all feels like it has to mean something. And it's quite poetic to think that just like all the other Misbegotten, Hugh likely also draws his roots back to Radagon. Is that perhaps why Marika entrusted him with the task of creating a weapon capable of slaying a god? Was the end goal for Radagon's order to be shattered by a weapon that was forged by a cursed and discarded aspect of himself? A part he wanted to forget, but could never fully hide away. And on that note, this might be a complete stretch, but bear with me for a moment. As you guys are all familiar with, throughout their trailers and official game materials, From Software decided to use this, the Raging Wolf armor set, to represent our main Tarnished character. But what you may not have noticed is that despite its name, which it takes from Vargrim, this armor set actually looks a lot more like a Misbegotten than it does any wolves we come across in the lands between. For instance, we can notice that the shoulders of the armor have a feathery motif similar to the wings and shoulders of the Misbegotten. The skirting of the armor, meanwhile, has this red fur-like texture that's similar to the red fur on the Misbegotten's legs. And in fact, beyond just these red pieces, it's clear that the overall color palette of this armor set, composed of reds, silvers, and grays, is nearly identical to many Misbegotten. So is it purely coincidental that they chose to clad our god-slaying protagonist, who eventually vanquishes Radagon, in an armor set that looks like a Misbegotten, one of his forsaken children? And I think this gets especially interesting when you consider the fact that, as I pointed out in this video in the card, there's decent reason to believe that our Tarnished is in fact an unwanted demigod child. But what do you guys think? Could the Misbegotten be cast-off pieces of Radagon? Or were they birthed another way? Why do you think this Leonin Misbegotten wields the Golden Order Greatsword? And how does Hugh tie into all of this? I'm honestly genuinely curious to hear your thoughts in the comments. But before I sign out, I'd also like to shout out this excellent video made by Kitetails that I found as my script was nearing completion that made many of these connections well before I did. You can check out her excellent video in the card, or head over to the description box for a complete list of all the sources I used in this video. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. It really helps out my small channel a lot, and I genuinely appreciate it. And hey, I'd also appreciate it if you considered supporting my work by becoming a patron, a YouTube member, or buying me a coffee. Thanks a ton for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.